James Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow as he bent over the engine of a '78 Chevrolet, his skilled hands working with practiced precision. The auto repair shop he built from the ground up in their small Tennessee town of Millbrook had become more than just a business. It was his legacy, his pride, and his children's future. His 12-year-old son Marcus sat on a worn wooden stool nearby, watching intently as his father explained the intricate workings of the carburetor. The air was thick with the familiar scents of motor oil and metal, mixed with the sweet aroma of Sarah Thompson's homemade cornbread wafting in from their modest house next door. "You see, son," James said, pointing to the engine components, "understanding how things work is just as important as knowing how to fix them." His deep voice carried the wisdom of years, and Marcus hung on to every word. James had always believed in teaching his children, Marcus and his younger sister Lisa, the value of honest work and integrity. The Thompson family wasn't wealthy by any measure, but they were respected in their community. James had built his reputation on fair prices and quality work, drawing customers from all over the county. White or black, people knew that Thompson's Auto Repair was the place to go when your car needed fixing. Their home, a simple two-story structure painted pale blue, sat just behind the shop. Sarah had planted roses along the front walkway, and on warm evenings, the family would gather on the porch, sharing stories and dreams while fireflies danced in the twilight. It wasn't much, but it was their piece of the American dream. Marcus remembered how his father would come home each evening, his clothes stained with grease but his spirit undiminished. James would clean up, help Sarah with dinner, and then sit with his children, checking their homework and sharing lessons about life. "Education is something nobody can take from you," he'd often say, encouraging them to study hard and aim high. The spring of 1985 had started like any other. The dogwoods were blooming, and business was steady at the shop. James had just hired a new apprentice mechanic, teaching him the trade just as he hoped to teach Marcus one day. The family had even started saving for a vacation to visit Sarah's relatives in Georgia, their first real family trip in years. Life wasn't perfect, of course. They felt the subtle and not-so-subtle effects of being a black family in a predominantly white southern town. There were certain neighborhoods where they knew they weren't welcome, stores where they'd be watched a little too closely, and people who'd cross the street rather than pass them on the sidewalk. But James had taught his children to hold their heads high and let their character speak for itself. That spring, Marcus had started helping out more in the shop after school. He loved the feeling of accomplishment when he helped his father fix a difficult problem, and the pride in James's eyes when his son showed aptitude for the work. Lisa, at 9 years old, would often bring them cold lemonade, her pigtails bouncing as she skipped across the shop floor. Sarah worked part-time as a nurse at the local clinic, her gentle nature and skilled care making her popular with patients. Between her income and the shop's earnings, the Thompsons were able to maintain a comfortable, if modest, lifestyle. They even had enough to help out at their church's food bank every month. Something James insisted on because there's always someone who needs help more than we do. Nobody could have predicted how quickly their world would shatter. The robbery at Millbrook Hardware Store on May 15, 1985, seemed like just another sad headline in the local paper. The Thompsons discussed it over dinner, with James shaking his head at the state of things and reminding his children that crime never pays. They had no way of knowing that this event would tear their family apart. No way to prepare for the storm that was coming. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, James hugged his children close and told them stories about his own childhood, unaware that these moments of peace were numbered. The next morning, James opened his shop as usual at 7 a.m. sharp. The spring air was crisp, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the tool-lined walls. It was a morning like any other, except it would be the last normal morning the Thompson family would know for a very long time. The morning of May 16, 1985, started like any other at Thompson's Auto Repair. James had just finished his morning coffee when 3 police cruisers suddenly pulled into the shop's gravel driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the stones. The sound made Marcus, who was organizing tools before school, look up from his work. 6 officers emerged from their vehicles, hands resting on their holsters. Detective Rogers, a man known in Millbrook for his harsh treatment of the black community, led the group. His face showed no emotion as he approached James, who had stepped out from under a Buick he'd been working on. "James Thompson," Detective Rogers announced, his voice carrying across the quiet shop. You're under arrest for the armed robbery of Millbrook Hardware Store." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Marcus watched in horror as his father raised his grease-stained hands slowly, confusion evident on his face. "There must be some mistake," James said calmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "I was here at the shop all day yesterday. My customers can vouch for that." Sarah, who had been about to leave for her nursing shift, ran out from the house when she heard the commotion. "James!" she cried out, but two officers blocked her path. Lissa followed behind her mother, her small hands clutching Sarah's dress, tears already streaming down her face. The scene that unfolded seemed like a nightmare. The officers roughly handcuffed James, not even allowing him to wash the grease from his hands. Several customers who had been waiting for their cars watched in shock, including Mr. Peterson, a regular client who had been there the entire previous day while James fixed his truck's transmission. "This is wrong." Mr. Peterson stepped forward. "James was working on my truck all day yesterday. He couldn't have robbed any store." But Detective Rogers dismissed him with a wave of his hand, not even bothering to take down his information. Marcus would never forget the sight of his father being pushed into the back of a police car, still wearing his work uniform with Thompson's Auto stitched above the pocket. James looked at his family and managed to call out, "It's going to be okay. Call Uncle Ray and tell him to contact Mr. Wilson, the lawyer." As the police cars drove away, Sarah held her children close, trying to be strong even as her own tears fell. Customers gathered around them, offering support in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Mr. Peterson immediately wrote down his contact information, promising to testify about James's whereabouts during the robbery. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By afternoon, the local newspaper had already printed a story, the headline reading, "Local auto shop owner arrested in hardware store robbery." The article mentioned James's race prominently, but barely noted his 20 years of business ownership or his standing in the community. That evening, the Thompson house felt empty without James. Sarah made calls from their kitchen phone, her voice alternating between determination and desperation as she contacted family members and friends. Uncle Ray, James's brother, arrived from 2 towns over, bringing with him Mr. Wilson, a tired-looking lawyer who had handled civil rights cases before. Marcus sat on the stairs, listening as the adults talked in hushed voices in the kitchen. He learned that the only evidence against his father was a vague witness description of a tall black man, and the fact that James's shop was located just 3 blocks from the hardware store. "They had no right to arrest him like this," Mr. Wilson said, his pen scratching against paper as he took notes. "We'll fight this, Sarah. James has alibis, and there's no physical evidence linking him to the crime." But Marcus could hear the worry in their voices. He understood enough about their town to know that sometimes, for people like them, innocence wasn't enough. He remembered how his father had once explained that they had to work twice as hard and be twice as good just to be treated fairly. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, remembering how just that morning, everything had been normal. His father had been teaching him about carburetors, telling jokes, and planning weekend fishing trips. Now, James was spending his first night in a jail cell, away from his family, accused of a crime he didn't commit, while their lives hung in the balance of a justice system that seemed anything but just. The Millbrook County Courthouse stood imposingly against the gray October sky as Marcus and his family climbed its worn stone steps. 3 months had passed since James's arrest, and today marked the beginning of his trial. Sarah had dressed her children in their Sunday best, Marcus in a borrowed suit that was slightly too big, and Lisa in her navy blue dress. Inside the courtroom, Judge William Hartford's reputation preceded him. At 68 years old, he presided over the county's criminal cases for nearly 3 decades. The whispers among the local black community told stories of his harsh sentences and obvious bias, but few dared to speak openly about it. Marcus watched as his father was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. James had lost weight during his time in county jail, his face thinner, but his eyes still held their dignity. He managed a small smile at his family before taking his seat beside Mr. Wilson. The trial began with Judge Hartford's piercing gaze sweeping across the courtroom. His demeanor changed noticeably when addressing the defense versus the prosecution. When Mr. Wilson stood to speak, Hartford would frequently interrupt him with sharp comments and dismissive gestures. The prosecution's case was weak. They had no physical evidence linking James to the robbery, no fingerprints, No stolen money found, no weapon recovered. Their star witness, Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store, could only testify that she saw a tall black man running away. When pressed about identifying James specifically, she admitted she couldn't be certain. Mr. Wilson called forward multiple witnesses who could verify James's whereabouts during the robbery. Mr. Peterson testified about his truck being at the shop all day, showing receipts and documentation. 3 other customers came forward with similar accounts. Even the mail carrier confirmed seeing James working on vehicles during his regular route that day. But Judge Hartford's bias became increasingly apparent. He sustained nearly every objection from the prosecutor while overruling most of Mr. Wilson's. When Sarah took the stand to testify about her husband's character and his whereabouts, Hartford's questioning bordered on hostile. During a lunch recess, Marcus overheard 2 court clerks whispering in the hallway. "Hartford's doing it again," one said. "Just like the Jackson case last year. You remember? Another black man, another harsh sentence, despite the evidence." The most shocking moment came when Mr. Wilson attempted to introduce evidence of another suspect, a known robber who had been seen in the area and matched the actual description of the perpetrator. Judge Hartford not only excluded this evidence but threatened Mr. Wilson with contempt of court for even trying to present it. Marcus watched his mother's hands grip her purse tighter with each passing hour. Lisa, too young to fully understand the legal proceedings, still sensed the tension and remained unusually quiet. The few black faces in the courtroom gallery exchanged knowing looks as Hartford repeatedly showed his prejudice. The defense's strongest moment came when they presented documentation of James's bank records and business transactions from the day of the robbery. These papers clearly showed him processing payments and completing work orders during the exact time the crime occurred. However, Judge Hartford deemed them circumstantial and instructed the jury to give them little weight. Throughout the proceedings, Hartford's subtle yet persistent bias manifested in various ways. He allowed the prosecutor to paint James as a desperate business owner who needed quick cash, despite tax records showing the auto shop's steady profits. When Mr. Wilson tried to object to this characterization, Hartford silenced him with a stern warning. As the trial's 3rd day drew to a close, Marcus noticed his father's shoulders slumping slightly. The constant barrage of prejudice was taking its toll, not just on James but on the entire family. Sarah had dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, and Marcus had overheard her crying in her room when she thought the children were asleep. The corrupted nature of the system became clearest when Judge Hartford gave his instructions to the jury. His words seemed carefully chosen to lead them toward a guilty verdict, emphasizing the prosecution's points while minimizing the defense's evidence. Mr. Wilson's objection to these instructions was quickly overruled, with Hartford giving him a cold stare that spoke volumes about his prejudices. As the jury filed out for deliberations, Marcus caught his father's eye. James gave him a brave smile, but both knew they were watching justice bend under the weight of racial bias, guided by the hand of a judge who had already decided the outcome long before the trial began. The jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation, a bad sign that made Sarah grasp Marcus's hand tighter. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hartford called for the verdict to be read. Marcus could hear his own heart pounding in his ears as he watched the jury foreman stand. "We find the defendant, James Thompson, guilty of armed robbery in the 1st degree." The words hit the Thompson family like physical blows. Lisa burst into tears while Sarah sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. Marcus watched his father's shoulders stiffen, but James remained dignified, his expression unchanged even as the verdict condemned him. "Order in the court," Judge Hartford's voice boomed, though there was hardly any disruption beyond Lisa's quiet sobs. His thin lips curved into what Marcus would later remember as a slight smile. "The defendant will rise for sentencing." James stood slowly, his orange jumpsuit bright against the dark wood of the courtroom. Mr. Wilson placed a supportive hand on his client's shoulder, his own face tight with controlled anger at the injustice unfolding before him. "James Thompson," Hartford began, peering down from his bench with cold eyes, "this court has found you guilty of a serious crime against our community. While the standard sentence for armed robbery typically ranges from 5 to 7 years, given the circumstances, I believe a harsher sentence is warranted." Mr. Wilson immediately objected. "Your Honor, there are no aggravating factors in this case. Mr. Thompson has no prior record, is a business owner, and a respected member of this community. Hartford's gavel crashed down. Objection overruled, Mr. Wilson. I will not have you questioning this court's authority. He turned back to James, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even the court reporter looked up in shock. 15 years was more than double the typical sentence, and everyone knew it. Marcus watched as his mother swayed slightly in her seat, Uncle Ray quickly steadying her. Furthermore, Hartford continued, the defendant's business license will be suspended, and he will be required to pay restitution in the amount of $25,000 to Millbrook Hardware Store. It was a death sentence for their family business. Without James's license, and with such a massive fine, the shop would have to close. Sarah's nursing salary alone couldn't support the family and pay for appeals. As the bailiffs approached to lead James away, he turned to his family. Stay strong, he called out. I love you all. Marcus, take care of your mother and sister. His voice broke slightly on the last words, the first crack in his composure since the trial began. Marcus stood, trying to reach his father, but the bailiffs had already begun moving him toward the door. Dad, he called out, but the sound was lost in the general commotion of the courtroom clearing. Through tear-blurred eyes, Marcus watched Judge Hartford gather his papers, appearing completely unbothered by the family he had just destroyed. The judge paused briefly at the prosecutor's table, sharing what looked like a satisfied nod before exiting through his private chamber door. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Sarah pulled her children close, trying to shield them as they pushed through the crowd. Questions flew at them from all directions. Mrs. Thompson, how do you feel about the verdict? What will happen to the auto shop? Do you think the sentence was fair? Uncle Ray helped guide them to their car, his large frame blocking most of the photographers. As they drove home, the reality of the situation began to sink in. 15 years. Marcus would be 27 when his father got out. Lisa would be grown. Their comfortable life, built on James's hard work and integrity, had been shattered by a corrupt judge's gavel. That evening, as Sarah tried to maintain normalcy by making dinner, Marcus stood in the doorway of his father's now empty shop. Tools still lay exactly where James had left them on that May morning, waiting for their owner's return. The boy picked up a wrench, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and made a silent promise to his father. Somehow, someway, they would fight this injustice. They would not let Judge Hartford's racism destroy their family without a fight. The years following James's conviction brought a relentless struggle for the Thompson family. Sarah worked double shifts at the hospital, picking up every extra hour she could to pay for the appeals process. The auto shop, once their family's pride, stood closed and silent, gathering dust as tools rusted on their hooks. Marcus, now 14, watched his mother transform from a gentle nurse into a fierce warrior for justice. Every evening, after her exhausting shifts, she would spread legal documents across their kitchen table, studying them until her eyes grew red and tired. Mr. Wilson had helped them find a new appeals lawyer, Ms. Rodriguez, who took their case at a reduced rate after learning about Judge Hartford's history. There's a pattern here. Ms. Rodriguez explained one evening, spreading out documents from other cases. Hartford has given black defendants sentences averaging 60% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. We found 20 similar cases in the past 5 years alone. Hope flickered when new evidence emerged in their favor. A man named Terry Collins, arrested for another robbery, had confessed to the hardware store crime during a police interrogation. He matched the original witness description perfectly and had even known details about the robbery that weren't public knowledge. But Judge Hartford's influence ran deep in the county's legal system. The confession was deemed inadmissible on a technicality, and their first appeal was denied. Sarah sold her wedding ring to pay for the next round of legal fees. Marcus spent his weekends visiting his father at the state prison, an hour's drive away. The visits were hard. Watching James age behind glass, his hair starting to gray at the temples, his eyes carrying a weariness that hadn't been there before. Yet he never lost his dignity, always asking about Marcus's schoolwork and reminding him to help take care of his sister. During one visit, James shared shocking news. Another inmate told me something about Hartford, he said quietly. Apparently, he was overheard at the country club, bragging about keeping certain people in their place, said he was cleaning up the town one case at a time. Ms. Rodriguez tried to use this information, but the witness, a waiter at the club, suddenly refused to testify, hinting at threats to his job and family. The appeal court seemed more interested in protecting one of their own than addressing the obvious injustice. The strain began showing on everyone. Lisa, now 11, had started having nightmares. Sarah's health declined from the stress and overwork. Marcus found himself growing angry at the world, though he tried to channel that anger into helping with the appeals, often staying up late to help his mother organize case files. A breakthrough came in their third year of appeals when they connected with the Southern Justice Project, a civil rights organization that had been tracking judicial misconduct cases. They found evidence that Hartford had made explicitly racist comments in other settings and had financial ties to private prisons benefiting from his harsh sentences. This goes beyond one wrongful conviction, their new legal team explained. We're looking at systematic abuse of judicial power. Hartford's been doing this for decades, but no one's been able to prove it until now. The team uncovered hundreds of potentially biased sentences, creating a statistical pattern that was hard to ignore. They found cases where Hartford had given black defendants maximum sentences for first offenses while giving white defendants probation for similar crimes. But the system moved slowly, deliberately so, it seemed. Each appeal took months to process. Each new piece of evidence faced bureaucratic hurdles. Meanwhile, James remained behind bars, missing birthdays, holidays, and countless family moments. Sarah started attending advocacy meetings, sharing their story with other families affected by Hartford's prejudice. Slowly, a movement began building. Local newspapers, which had once condemned James, started questioning Hartford's record. Civil rights organizations began protesting outside the courthouse. Marcus, who had inherited his father's quiet strength, never lost faith. He kept a calendar in his room, marking off the days until the next appeal hearing. He collected newspaper clippings about judicial misconduct cases, studying them late into the night, trying to understand the system that had taken his father. One evening, as Sarah reviewed yet another appeal document, Marcus found her crying at the kitchen table. "We'll get him out, Mom," he promised, putting his arm around her shoulders. "The truth has to matter sometime." Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened the papers. "Your father always said justice might be slow, but it comes to those who fight for it," she replied, her voice strengthening. "And we'll keep fighting, no matter how long it takes." The Thompson household had developed a new normal in the years following James's imprisonment. Sarah's nursing uniform now hung in multiples in her closet, evidence of her endless double shifts. Marcus, at 16, had grown tall like his father, his childhood memories of working in the auto shop feeling more distant with each passing day. Every morning, Sarah would leave before dawn for her early shift at the hospital, then work late into the evening at a nearby clinic. The extra hours meant more money for appeals, but the cost showed in the deepening lines around her eyes and the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Prison visits had become their version of family gatherings. Every other Sunday, they would make the long drive to the state penitentiary, passing through security checks and metal detectors to spend precious hours with James. The visiting room was always the same: harsh fluorescent lights, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and guards watching their every move. Marcus noticed how his father changed with each visit. James' once strong hands had grown softer without daily mechanic work. His hair was now more gray than black, and his prison uniform hung looser on his frame. Yet he still maintained his dignity, always asking about their lives with genuine interest, though Marcus could see the pain in his eyes when hearing about the moments he was missing. Lisa, now 13, struggled the most. She had been too young when James was taken to have many clear memories of life before. Sometimes she would sit in the closed auto shop, running her fingers over her father's old tools, trying to connect with the man she barely knew outside of prison visits. "Tell me about Dad," she would ask Marcus late at night, when their mother was working her evening shift. "What was he like when he was home?" Marcus would share stories about working in the shop, about their father's patient teaching, his deep laugh, and his way of making everyone feel important. The community had changed too. Some people who had once been friends now crossed the street to avoid them, as if wrongful conviction was contagious. Others, like Mr. Peterson, remained loyal, regularly checking on the family and helping with odd jobs around the house. Marcus took on the role of man of the house, learning to fix things through trial and error since he couldn't ask his father for guidance. He got a part-time job at a local grocery store, wanting to help with the bills even though Sarah insisted he focus on school. His grades remained good. He knew how much education meant to his father. The closed auto shop became a symbol of their loss. Through the dusty windows, you could still see James's tools laid out exactly as he'd left them that morning in 1985. Sarah couldn't bear to sell anything, holding on to hope that someday James would return to work there again. Holidays were the hardest. They would visit James on Christmas morning, bringing the few small gifts allowed by prison regulations. The forced cheer in the visiting room, surrounded by other families trying to celebrate under fluorescent lights and watchful guards, made the season feel hollow. Sarah tried to keep their family traditions alive. She still cooked Sunday dinners, setting a place for James, even though his chair remained empty. She helped Lisa with her homework, just as James would have done, and attended every one of Marcus's school events, clapping enough for 2 parents. The financial strain was constant. Appeal costs mounted, and even with Sarah's multiple jobs, they struggled to keep up. They had to sell their second car, and Marcus overheard his mother on the phone with creditors late at night, her voice tight with worry as she asked for more time to pay bills. Sometimes, Marcus would wake to find his mother asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal papers and old family photos. On these nights, he would quietly cover her with a blanket and put away the painful reminders of their fight for justice. The absence of James created a void that nothing could fill. Simple moments, like when Marcus changed the oil in their remaining car or when Lisa needed help with a science project, highlighted how much they missed his guidance and presence. Yet they persevered. Sarah would say, "Your father's strength lives in both of you," whenever the weight of his absence felt too heavy. They learned to lean on each other, forming a tight unit of 3 instead of 4, holding on to hope while learning to live with a grief that never fully subsided. Each night, before bed, Marcus would look at the family photo on his dresser, taken just weeks before the arrest, and whisper a promise to his father. "We're still here, Dad. We're still fighting. We won't give up." In the 12th year of James's imprisonment, during a routine prison visit, Marcus immediately noticed something was wrong. His father, now 54, looked unusually pale and thin. James tried to maintain his usual cheerful demeanor, but he couldn't hide the persistent cough that interrupted their conversation. "It's nothing," James insisted when Sarah pressed him about his health, "just a cold that won't go away." But his hands trembled as he held the visiting room phone, and the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. 2 weeks later, they received the call that would shatter their world again. James had collapsed in the prison yard and been taken to the prison infirmary. The diagnosis was devastating. Stage 4 lung cancer already spread to his lymph nodes and bones. Sarah immediately filed emergency petitions for compassionate release, her nursing background helping her understand the dire nature of the diagnosis. Marcus, now 24, took time off from college to help with the paperwork and legal processes. But the system that had wrongly imprisoned James moved with cruel slowness even in the face of his terminal illness. The prison medical care was woefully inadequate. James was given basic pain medication but had to wait weeks to see specialists. Each delay allowed the cancer to spread further, eating away at his once strong body. Sarah fought desperately to get him proper treatment, making calls to every authority she could reach. "He needs chemotherapy now," she'd argued with prison officials, her voice breaking with frustration. "Every day you delay treatment reduces his chances." But the bureaucratic maze of prison healthcare meant each request had to go through multiple approvals, each taking precious time they didn't have. When they were finally allowed to visit him in the prison hospital wing, the change in James was shocking. The proud man who had maintained his dignity through 12 years of wrongful imprisonment now lay tethered to an oxygen tank, his cheekbones sharp against his hollow face. Lisa, now 21, broke down at the sight of her father. She had spent more years of her life with him in prison than out, and now she was watching him slip away. James tried to comfort her, his voice weak, but still carrying that familiar gentleness. "Don't cry, baby girl," he whispered. "I've lived to see you both grow into amazing people. That's more than enough for any father." The cancer progressed rapidly. Each visit found James weaker, though he never complained about his condition. Instead, he used his remaining strength to share final pieces of wisdom with his children, to tell Sarah how much he had always loved her, to make peace with his fate. Marcus spent every possible moment at the prison hospital, often sitting silently beside his father's bed, holding his hand as James drifted in and out of consciousness. During lucid moments, James would share memories of happier times or give final pieces of advice. "Keep fighting for justice," he told Marcus during one such moment. "Not just for me, but for everyone wrongly condemned by hatred and prejudice. Promise me that, son." The prison finally approved James for hospital transfer when it was already too late. 3 days after the approval came through, before the transfer could take place, James Thompson took his last breath in the prison hospital wing, still legally guilty of a crime he never committed. Sarah was with him at the end, having refused to leave his side for the last 48 hours. She held his hand as he slipped away, whispering words of love and forgiveness, promising to continue the fight to clear his name. The cruelty of the system followed them even in death. Prison regulations meant they couldn't properly dress James in his own clothes for the funeral. The prison insisted on guards being present at the service, as if a dead man might somehow escape their custody. At the funeral, Marcus stood strong for his mother and sister, just as his father had taught him. The church was packed with people from their community. Customers from the old auto shop, Sarah's colleagues from the hospital, and many others whose lives James had touched before his imprisonment. Mr. Peterson, now elderly but still standing tall, spoke at the service. James Thompson died an innocent man, no matter what any court says. He lived with more dignity in prison than his accusers showed in freedom. As they lowered the casket, Marcus made a silent vow to his father. The fight wasn't over. They would clear his name, expose Judge Hartford's corruption, and ensure James Thompson's true legacy would be one of justice, not injustice. James Thompson had died behind bars, but his spirit remained unbroken, his dignity intact, his love for his family unwavering until the very end. 2 years after James Thompson's death, Marcus stood before the state appeals court, his law degree fresh in his hand. He had dedicated his studies to understanding the system that had destroyed his father's life, and now he was fighting to change it from within. The Southern Justice Project had uncovered a treasure trove of evidence about Judge Hartford's misconduct. Decades of documented racial bias, hidden financial connections to private prisons, and dozens of testimonies from court staff who had witnessed his prejudiced behavior were finally coming to light. Sarah sat in the courtroom, watching her son present evidence in his father's posthumous appeal. Her hair had turned completely gray, but her eyes burned with the same determination that had sustained their family through 15 years of injustice. Lisa, now working as a prison reform advocate, sat beside her, clutching the same worn Bible their father had kept in his cell. The evidence shows not just a single wrongful conviction, Marcus argued before the panel of judges, but a systematic pattern of judicial misconduct that has destroyed countless lives in our community. My father's case was just one thread in a tapestry of injustice woven by Judge Hartford. The new evidence was overwhelming. Terry Collins, the man who had confessed to the hardware store robbery years ago, had finally been located. Now dying of liver disease, he provided a detailed sworn statement about the crime, including information only the real perpetrator could have known. Former court clerks came forward, no longer afraid of retaliation since Hartford's retirement. They testified about hearing the judge make racist remarks in chambers and witnessing him deliberately manipulating cases involving black defendants. The waiter from the country club, who had been too scared to testify years ago, finally shared his account of Hartford's boasts about keeping certain people in their place. The investigation expanded beyond James's case. A review of Hartford's 30-year tenure revealed over 300 cases showing significant racial bias in sentencing. The State Bar Association launched its own investigation, and several civil rights organizations joined the fight. Mr. Peterson, now in his 80s and using a walker, testified about that day in the auto shop, his voice strong as he described James working on his truck during the exact time of the robbery. His detailed records from that day, carefully preserved for all these years, provided crucial timeline evidence. The breakthrough came when a former prosecutor, retiring and facing his own conscience, admitted to colluding with Hartford to target black business owners in their community. James's case had been part of a larger scheme to maintain what Hartford had called the right social order in Millbrook. On a rainy Tuesday morning in October, 15 years and 5 months after James's arrest, the appeals court delivered its decision. Marcus held his mother's hand as the chief judge spoke the words they had waited so long to hear. In light of overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct and clear proof of innocence, this court hereby vacates the conviction of James Thompson and orders his record expunged. Sarah wept openly as the judge continued, detailing how the evidence had exposed a pattern of systematic racism that had tainted hundreds of cases. The court ordered a review of all of Hartford's criminal cases, opening the door for many other wrongfully convicted individuals to seek justice. The Thompson family's fight had become a catalyst for change. The state legislature passed the James Thompson Justice Reform Act, establishing new oversight measures for judicial conduct and creating a special commission to review cases of potential racial bias in sentencing. The old auto shop, which Sarah had never sold, was transformed into the Thompson Center for Legal Justice, a nonprofit organization providing legal assistance to families fighting wrongful convictions. The tools James had used to fix cars still hung on the walls, now surrounded by law books and case files. Marcus often stood in his father's old shop, now his legal office, looking at the faded photo of James that hung above the desk. "We did it, Dad," he would whisper. "Your name is clear, and your fight lives on." The family's story became a symbol of both the brutal reality of systemic racism and the power of persistent hope. Sarah continued working at the hospital, now counseling families of incarcerated patients. Lissa developed programs helping children of imprisoned parents, ensuring no child felt as lost as she had. James Thompson's legacy lived on not just in the legal reforms that bore his name, but in the countless lives touched by his family's relentless pursuit of justice. His story became a testament to the enduring power of truth and the importance of never giving up, no matter how long the odds or how dark the night.